I always believed that you could choose your own fate. I was only 30, and I was so proud of my choice, a small but cozy apartment in Gaumel. Outside the window, the maples rustled, and inside, after long weeks of renovation, everything sparkled as if it were a picture from a magazine. New furniture, freshly painted walls the color of baked milk, and that oak parquet floor that cost me half my salary, it gleamed in the morning sunlight, promising a bright and independent future. I thought this was my personal refuge, my castle, where only I was allowed entry. My very own little corner, bought with a mortgage that, at the time, felt less like a burden and more like a symbol of adulthood. But the fairy tale ended as quickly as it began. At the office where I worked as a graphic designer, layoffs hit. My position was among those cut. And so, just a few months before the parquet lost its shine, I found myself trapped. The bank contract, like a predator lying in wait, sent bills every month, bills I could no longer pay. I tried to save on everything I could, stopped ordering food delivery, gave up going to cafes, bought only the cheapest groceries. My once bright and stylish outfits, like that champagne-colored silk slip dress I loved to wear around the house, gathered dust in the closet, and I could only afford a couple of new pairs of tights each month. But nothing helped, the numbers just didn't add up. And then, like a blow from an axe, the thought I had tried so hard to push away came to me: I would have to rent out a room. I didn't want anyone intruding on my world. The call from my cousin Marina in Minsk came like a bolt from the blue. She knew about my troubles and offered a solution that seemed almost absurd. I met someone, a friend of my neighbor's uncle. He's a professor from Siberia, moved to Gaumel for a year for treatment at a local clinic. He needs a quiet, peaceful place, no noise. An older man, very polite, he won't cause you any trouble. Trust me, he's the perfect option for you, she assured me. I hesitated. But the voice of reason, reinforced by the bank's threats, was stronger than my fears. 2 weeks later, I stood by the door waiting for him, my heart pounding with a strange mix of anxiety and relief. He arrived right on time. Tall, with a straight, almost rigid back, and huge, knotted hands that seemed more suited to a hammer and anvil than to a book and fountain pen. He looked about 70, but in his posture and unhurried walk there was a kind of ageless, unbroken strength. I looked at his hands, resting on the handle of his suitcase, and it seemed to me that every vein was a story, every wrinkle a decade lived. He brought with him a worn coat, as if the cold of his homeland was always with him. "Thank you for having me," his voice was deep and velvety, and his gaze made me feel both uneasy and calm. I showed him to the spare room, and without a word, he ran his huge palm over the table, as if studying its texture. The first few weeks of living together passed in a strange but predictable silence. He turned out to be a man of strict habits. He woke up early, had a quiet breakfast, read a lot. Every morning he went to the clinic and returned in the evenings. I spent my days in fruitless job searches, sending out resumes to dozens of companies and getting used to his presence. We rarely spoke, exchanging only brief phrases about the weather or what we made for dinner. But his presence was felt in everything. The sound of his confident steps in the hallway, the creak of his door, his shadow gliding across the wall as he passed by, everything about him inspired a quiet respect. I often caught myself watching his hands as he turned the pages of a book or held a cup. They were so big, so masculine, with wide palms, and I couldn't help but imagine all that those hands had been through. One day I came home earlier than usual. I walked into the hallway, slipped off my favorite fitted satin dress, changed into a silk robe, and headed to the kitchen. On the way, I saw him in the living room. He was sitting on the couch reading, sunlight falling on his face. For a moment, he seemed younger than his years. He nodded a greeting without looking up from his book. I paused, pretending to look at something on my phone, but in reality, I was secretly watching him. This strange mix of respect and curiosity he evoked in me grew stronger every day. His habits, his silence, his unhurried movements, all of it became a kind of ritual for me, a signal that I was not alone. And then, on one ordinary morning, everything changed. I woke up late, the house was quiet. The sound of running water came from the bathroom. Without thinking, I headed to the kitchen with a cup in hand, wrapped in my favorite robe of the finest silk. The fabric was cool against my skin, and I shivered. Passing by the bathroom, I saw the door was ajar, with warm steam escaping through the gap. For a moment, my gaze involuntarily slipped inside. He was standing under the shower. His body, still strong despite the years, seemed solid, carved from stone. I froze in place. And my gaze dropped lower. I stopped dead. It was not what I expected to see in a 75-year-old man. What I saw there surpassed everything I knew about men, even those much younger than him. My cheeks flushed. My heart pounded in my chest like a trapped bird. With a trembling hand, I quickly closed the door, but the image had already been forever imprinted in my mind. I leaned my back against the wall, trying to catch my breath. I kept telling myself it was an accident, that I shouldn't have looked, but I knew that image would stay with me for a long time. Inside me, something had ignited, a spark I didn't know how to extinguish. I spent the rest of the day in anxiety, unable to focus on anything. I couldn't believe that such an elderly man could stir such strong excitement in me, a trembling I hadn't felt in a long time. When I saw him that evening in the kitchen, calmly brewing tea, I could barely raise my eyes to him. He acted as usual, but I felt that I could no longer look him in the eye. That evening, I realized he was no longer just my tenant. Since that morning, he had become my secret, pulsing inside me, a secret that both frightened and attracted me. The days after that morning dragged on slowly, like thick molasses. I tried to return to my usual life, but it was impossible. Every time I heard his footsteps in the hallway, I flinched. Every morning when he left his room, his shadow on the wall seemed larger and more real than before. The image from the bathroom, which I tried so hard to erase from memory, returned again and again, burning me from within. It was like an unwanted but obsessive melody playing in my head without stopping. Everything in the house changed. The living room, the kitchen, the hallway, every corner seemed to carry echoes of what I had seen. Suddenly, I started noticing things I had never paid attention to before. How carefully he set his cup on the saucer, how his fingers, so big and strong, gripped the newspaper. His movements were precise, measured, there was no elderly awkwardness in them, but rather a deliberate, unhurried strength. I caught myself watching him when he read, when he sat down at the table. My silk robe, which once seemed to me just comfortable homeware, now felt like a kind of armor protecting me from his presence. But it was a strange protection, because I wanted him to notice me. My curiosity, so innocent at first, had turned into an obsession. I began to watch for his routine, the sound of water in the mornings, the creak of the chair when he sat at his desk. All of it became signs to me, confirming that I was not alone. I remembered his silhouette in the clouds of steam, and that memory made me tremble, not with fear, but with something else, unfamiliar. I even tried to imagine what he might smell like, a mix of men's cologne, old paper, and something else, something warm I couldn't quite define. One evening, as I showered, I realized all my movements had become slow, deliberate. I ran the soap over my body, and every time I touched my skin, I thought of him. Water streamed down my face, and with my eyes closed, I imagined his large hands touching me the same way, as he touched the table, as he held a book. It was shameful and thrilling at the same time. I realized I could no longer fight it. The memory of what I had seen, and my response to it, became a kind of game in which I was the only player. And then I made up my mind. It was an impulsive decision, driven by this new, burning need. I left the bathroom door slightly ajar. Water poured from the shower, and as I stepped into the clouds of steam, I felt the house freeze, as if waiting for a resolution. My heart pounded like a drum, my breath unsteady. I deliberately washed my hair slowly, letting my hands glide over my body. I felt like I was nothing but pure anticipation. I was waiting for him. I knew he would hear the sound of water. I knew he would notice the slightly open door. And I waited. I soaped my breasts, my stomach, my legs, and every movement was an invitation. The scent of shower gel, with notes of bergamot and mint, filled the bathroom, and it seemed to me he must be able to smell it from the hallway. And then I heard it, a faint creak of the floorboard. A barely audible, restrained step. He was there. I felt his presence behind the door as clearly as if he were standing right in front of me. I held my breath. I knew he was watching, standing there in the hallway, observing. I didn't move. On the contrary, I let myself exhale, long and quiet, as if confessing something to myself. I ran the soap over my arms and neck, making every movement intentional, inviting. It was a dangerous game, one I had started myself. And although part of me was afraid he would leave, another, much larger part, wanted him to stay. For him to stand there behind the door, breathing in the silence, while I showed myself to him without saying a word. When I turned off the water, I stood there, water streaming down my body. I knew he was still there. And in that heavy, loaded silence, I realized we had crossed an invisible boundary. When I came out into the hallway, I saw his shadow gliding along the wall. He was going to his room. I went into the living room, and he was already sitting on the sofa, reading as if nothing had happened. I was dressed in my silk robe, and I knew I looked desirable. He looked up from his book, and for a moment our eyes met. There were no words in them, but something much more, a secret we now shared. I sat down opposite him. I felt his gaze, and it was different, deeper. He looked at me as if he saw something new in me. "Is everything all right?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He slowly closed the book, set it aside, and nodded. "Yes, everything is all right." But there was something in his voice that sent shivers down my spine. Silence fell. Long, drawn out. I fidgeted with the glass of water in my hands, unable to hold his gaze for more than a few seconds. I remembered the steam, his silhouette, that moment when I realized he was behind the door, and the thought burned inside me. Suddenly, he spoke, his voice low and serious. "You shouldn't leave the bathroom door open." My heart skipped a beat. I swallowed. It was an accident, I lied, knowing he didn't believe me. His eyes, calm and perceptive, locked onto mine. "It doesn't seem like it," he replied, and in his words there was neither condemnation nor surprise, only a statement of fact. Silence hung in the air again. This time it was dense, vibrating. I realized my hands were shaking, and to hide it, I stood up and pretended to fix the pillows on the couch. As I bent over, I found myself too close to him. I felt the warmth of his body, the light touch of his hand on my waist. I didn't pull away immediately. I allowed that minimal contact to last a second longer than necessary. That was enough to ignite a fire. He slowly raised his hand, as if afraid to scare me off, and touched the back of my hand. A simple, almost innocent gesture, but it carried such incredible weight that I held my breath. I looked at him, and in that exchange of glances I understood that there was no turning back for either of us. The night after that evening in the living room passed in agonizing wakefulness. I tossed and turned, trying to fall asleep, but couldn't. The touch of his hand on my wrist, the look we exchanged, everything kept pulsing in my skin. As if he had left an invisible but tangible mark on it. I replayed in my mind every second of our conversation, every word he said, every touch we shared. The inner world of my little kingdom, my refuge, was destroyed, and in its place arose something new, strange, but incredibly alluring. The next day, despite everything, was not awkward. It was filled with unspoken anticipation. I tried to act as usual, made coffee, checked my email, but every rustle in the apartment, every step he took in the hallway, the creak of his chair in the dining room, everything now seemed charged with electricity. Everything took on a new, deeper meaning. It seemed even the air in the apartment became denser, filled with something between us, something we couldn't name. I found him at noon, sitting in the living room with a newspaper. Sunlight from the window fell on his face, highlighting every wrinkle, every fold, like a map of his lived years. As I passed by him, our hands brushed against each other again. This time I didn't pull away. Neither did he. It was just a moment, but it was enough for that invisible string stretched between us to vibrate even more strongly. Yesterday, he began in a low voice, but faltered, as if unsure whether to continue. My heart pounded wildly. I looked at him. Yes, yesterday, I whispered, my voice barely audible. Silence followed, so thick it seemed the air in the room had condensed. He slowly reached out and touched my wrist. His fingers, large and strong, were surprisingly gentle. I leaned in, as if my body had decided for me. Our faces were just centimeters apart. I could feel his breath, hear it. My lips trembled. I didn't know whether to step back or move forward. He closed the distance himself. His lips barely brushed mine. The kiss was unhurried. There was no haste or greed in it. It was slow, filled with everything we had hidden for so long and never spoken of. It was a kiss that felt like an eternity. It was so intense that for a moment I forgot about the age difference, about other people's opinions, about what should be. When we pulled away, my cheeks were burning, and he looked at me with gentle, calm confidence. "This shouldn't have happened," I whispered. He gently stroked my cheek with his large hand and replied with complete serenity, "But it did." We sat in silence, pressed close to each other, and in that moment I realized there was no way back. The apartment, once my personal refuge, now seemed like a place where the two of us lived in our own separate world. That kiss changed everything. The hallways, the kitchen, the living room, everything around us became an accomplice. After that day on the couch, in our little world inside the apartment in Gaumont, everything changed. The living room, which had once been just a place to relax, turned into a living archive of memories. Every time I walked by, I could feel the warmth of his hands on my waist, remember his weight as he leaned toward me, and the echo of that silence, which would never be innocent again. He changed, too. He was no longer just my tenant, the man who had come for treatment. Now he moved around the house with a new, calm confidence, as if an undeniable secret lived inside him, one we shared together. And I, instead of avoiding him, found myself seeking him out. Our new game was quiet, made up of long glances and seemingly accidental encounters. If I was cooking in the kitchen, he always found a reason to come in. If I heard him in the hallway, I would open my door just to meet his gaze. Everything was subtle, barely noticeable, but desire pulled us forward with relentless force. One morning I was standing by the stove, making coffee. Suddenly, I felt his presence behind me. He said nothing, just came so close that his breath touched the back of my neck. From that simple gesture, shivers ran all over my body. I slowly turned around, and our lips met again, this time by the cold marble countertop. The kitchen, filled with the aroma of freshly ground coffee, became a witness to our newfound intimacy. Another time, it was the hallway. I stepped out of the bathroom, wrapped in a terry towel, and bumped into him. We looked at each other in complete silence, and without thinking, I leaned against the wall. He raised his hand and gently stroked my cheek before leaning in toward me. The kiss was brief but so intense that the towel slipped slightly from my shoulder, and the air filled with a trembling that made us both hold our breath. Even the balcony, where I usually hung the laundry, became our secret refuge. One day, as I was taking down the sheets, he came out to help me. The wind whipped the fabric between us, and when we both reached for it at the same time, our hands touched. No one could see us from the street, but the sense of danger and forbiddenness was so electric that it made the moment even more searing. It seemed as if the entire apartment was conspiring in our favor. Every doorway, every corner, every nook bore witness to our desire, which could no longer be hidden. Our entire story so far had unfolded behind these walls. They were our accomplices, our shield from the outside world. But sooner or later, we would have to cross that boundary. And it happened when he suggested it during our morning coffee in the kitchen. "We should go out together," he said calmly. "We can't hide behind these walls forever." My heart skipped a beat. The idea of showing ourselves to the world was both terrifying and alluring. I imagined the glances, the whispers, the surprise of strangers when they saw a 30-year-old woman next to a 75-year-old man. The age difference, which seemed insignificant inside the apartment, would become huge and obvious outside. "I don't know if I'm ready," I whispered. He took my hand from the table. His fingers, large and warm, gave me a sense of calm. "It's not about being ready," he said. "It's about accepting who we are." 2 days later, we took the risk. It was a sunny Sunday, and Gonmel was buzzing with life. We walked down the stairs, my legs trembling, his step steady and confident. As soon as we stepped outside, I immediately felt the stares. An elderly couple looked at us disapprovingly. 2 teenagers passing by exchanged glances and giggled quietly. A woman walking her dog gave me a long, curious look. I lowered my eyes, my cheeks burning. It seemed as if every step was a challenge. But he walked with his head held high, with dignity, as if those stares didn't exist. And his calm began to transfer to me. Hesitantly, I took his arm, then squeezed it tighter. That contact gave me new strength. We walked down the main street, past shop windows and crowded cafes. We ordered coffee and sat on a summer terrace. The city's noise wrapped around us, but I still felt the stares. Every time someone turned to look, a lump rose in my throat. "Don't look at them," he whispered in my ear. "Look only at me." I obeyed, and in his eyes I found everything I needed: calm, tenderness, confidence that dispelled my fears. For the first time since all this began, I felt proud to be walking beside him, even if the whole world judged us. When we returned home and I closed the door, I realized what a huge step we had taken. Now, we were bound not only by our secret life, but also by the fact that we had gone out and challenged the world. I hugged him. "Thank you for not letting go of my hand," I said. "I never will," he replied. And I knew that, despite all the prejudice and whispers behind our backs, we had chosen to be together. Our story was only beginning. The echo of our walk through Gonmel was not long in coming. It was naive to think that in a city like ours, such a secret could be kept. The glances, the whispering, like a poisonous gas, it seeped into the air and then into our lives. The first sign was my sister, who called me in a deliberately casual tone. "I heard you were seen around town with some older guy." "Who is he?" she asked, making no attempt to hide her curiosity. I tried to joke it off, but her skeptical laugh and snide comment, "People talk more than you do," left me speechless. I hung up, feeling the lump in my throat. I told Ivan Ivanovich about it. We sat in the kitchen, eating dinner in silence. He listened calmly, chewing slowly. "It was inevitable," he said. "The question is, what will you do when suspicion becomes certainty?" His words hit the mark. I knew that sooner or later, I would have to face my family, and their judgment would be the hardest test. And then, the day came. My mother called me in a tone that burped no excuses. "Come for Sunday dinner. And bring him with you." I realized I could no longer hide. She didn't mention him by name, but I knew who she meant. I agreed, though I was trembling inside. I felt like I was heading to an execution. Ivan Ivanovich, as always, remained calm. "Do you want me to go with you?" he asked, and in his voice was the same confidence that had helped me out on the street. I replied, "Of course," though my heart was pounding. The dinner turned out to be a minefield. My sister immediately raised an eyebrow when she saw us. My cousin lowered his eyes, hiding a smirk. My mother was polite, but her eyes spoke of anything but hospitality. We sat down at the table. The dishes were laid out, but the air was too thick with unspoken questions for anyone to enjoy the food. My sister was the first to break. "Anya, are you really serious about him?" she asked. I swallowed and answered directly, "Yes." My brother smirked. "He could be your grandfather." Mother put her cutlery down on the plate with a clatter and began to speak. Her voice was as hard as stone. "You're 30 years old. You're young, beautiful. You have your whole life ahead of you. What are you doing with a man who is 75? What will people say about us?" I looked at Ivan Ivanovich, seeking support. He took my hand, which was lying on the table, in his huge palm. In his touch, there was that same calm strength. He looked into my mother's eyes without looking away. "She's not dating a 75-year-old man. She's dating me. The person I am, not my age." A heavy silence hung in the room. My mother sighed and went to the window, speaking without looking at us. "I don't want you to suffer. People are cruel, and life won't be easy when you choose a path others cannot understand." Tears welled up in my eyes. But with them came a new, unexpected strength. "I'd rather suffer for choices I make myself than live a life that doesn't belong to me," I replied, and my voice was firm. My sister just shook her head. My brother muttered something. No one touched the food again. The tension was unbearable. When we left the house, I felt ashamed, but at the same time strangely free. For the first time, I had spoken the truth aloud to my family. There was no turning back. Ivan Ivanovich hugged me at the door, ignoring the neighbors. "Now they know the truth," he whispered. "The hardest thing isn't what they think. The hardest thing is for you to believe in us yourself." His words became my beacon in the storm. We returned to our apartment, our refuge, which now seemed even more precious. We had survived this battle. I poured him some water. He sat in his armchair, his hands resting on the armrests. His gaze was still calm, but there was a new kind of fatigue in it. Suddenly, his hands began to tremble. He tried to pick up the cup, but it slipped from his fingers and crashed to the floor. He let out a low moan, and his body began to sag, as if all his strength had suddenly left him. He started to slump in the chair, his face turned pale, and the huge hands that had always been a symbol of strength and confidence for me hung helplessly. I rushed to him, shouting,